No, I try to make sure I don't make too many mistakes. I think sometimes I drop some balls and later on regretted it. Yes. Coming from the field. I'll just sit down there if possible.
Oh yes, I thought you were going to be on.
Yeah, because I'd rather have a stiff neck this way than that way. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Welcome everybody. I'm Eric Oshida, a second-year Southeast Asia concentrator serving as the president of the Southeast Asia League of Students during this academic year. As you know, SEALS does policy programming related to the region. So typically we do lunch events. This semester I expect will be generally on Mondays. But thank you everybody for coming on a Friday afternoon to hear from today's guest who is visiting from the region. Richard Heydarian is a Philippine journalist who serves as a columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, a television host at the GMA network, and an opinion contributor to the South China Morning Post, the Straits Times, and the Nikkei Asian Review. His latest book, which I understand will be the focus of today's talk, is The Indo-Pacific, Trump, China, and the New Struggle for Global Mastery. His other published works include The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy, published in 2017, as well as articles and interviews in many outlets, including The Atlantic, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, The New York Times, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. He has taught political science at Ateneo de Manila University and De La Salle University in the Philippines. Most recently was a visiting research fellow at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. Typically, as you know, we're off the record. Today's speaker, at his request, will be recording the opening part of today's event. However, question and answers will remain off the record to ensure a frank conversation. So thank you again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Richard Heydarian to SAIS.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my third talk today, so I hope there's still energy left in me. I think some people expect me to always give my more high-octane version. We'll try to make it more low-octane, especially because we're more cozy today. Actually, what I'm going to present today is kind of cuts into my upcoming books. I'm working on a new book, and this is based on my both policy academic, but also my journalistic experience, including interviewing protesters in Hong Kong, talking to and meeting officials in Taiwan, including President Tsai, so many senior officials across the region, and the title is something like The Great Backlash, right? It talks about growing resentment towards China as the novelty of its rise as an alternative to Western, Japanese, American superpowerdom, wears off. Now, just as a caveat, first of all, I'm not criticizing the Chinese people. I love the Chinese. So what we're talking about here is certain policies or nefarious influence of the Chinese communist regime. And in no way am I arguing that there's kind of a concrete or robust counter-alliance or whatever we're talking about containment. I'm putting forward those caveats because the previous talk I gave in Stanford last week, I got some interesting questions, right? And I only have 5 minutes. I don't know how far I'm going to go, so I think I have to make the caveats very clear. Now, what I'm going to talk about today deals on also a number of articles I've written, and it talks about the more politically correct term I used in my publication for Carnegie was China's inchoate hegemony. To make it a little bit PC, I'm using the word premature hegemony. Now, hegemony should be understood. I think the best definition of that comes from Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist thinker. Hegemony is kind of like soft power on steroids, right? It's the second phase of power. It's actually almost like structural power. Like you shape the preferences and the choices of other countries, so much so that a country becomes powerful enough to essentially dictate the strategic orientation of another country. So it's a pretty high threshold, which I believe other superpowers in history have met, including the Romans and Persians and the Chinese in ancient history. And I would argue even the United States, at least during the Cold War, and perhaps up until today in certain areas of the world. The question right now is China moving towards that direction? Now, in Silicon Valley, because that's where I came from just recently, there's this ideology of almost technological inevitabilism, right? This idea that technology will change our life in ways beyond our understanding, and that it's just a matter of adaptation with that. I think in geopolitics, the analog to that is Chinese hegemony inevitabilism. This idea that particularly in Southeast Asia, where I come from and I'm based, that it's almost a foregone conclusion that in decades to come that will be part of the Chinese, not only spheres of influence, but actually that region will be Finlandized and almost be an extension of Chinese, greater Chinese influence in Greater China. So with those caveats gone, and I already lost 5 minutes, I'm going to conduct this more lawyerly. Let's just move forward. Now, in history, in history, I think in historical analysis, and I think Francis Fukuyama, among others, have emphasized this, you have to make a distinction between what is essential and what is contingent. And in historical school of analysis, you also look at the distinction between événementiel analysis and longue durée analysis. Not lingerie, longue durée analysis. Événementiel looks at the shallow movements above the ocean, right? These are the daily current affairs, these are the contemporary developments. These are almost journalistic headlines that grab a lot of attention and kind of distort our notion of what's going to happen in the future, what has been happening in the short run. While at the same time, long durée analysis really look at these long-term structural movements and vulnerabilities. And what I try to do in my works is more look at the long durée. Now, it's easy to look at the latest development, including in my country, in the Philippines, and say, wow, it's over for the United States. Because with the abrogation of Visiting Forces Agreement, essentially our alliance, in the words of Department of Justice Secretary Guevara, it's practically useless. And that has a basis because the Visiting Forces Agreement is the software that operationalizes our alliance. It provides the legal framework for the entry and rotational stationing of American troops. And without a doubt, I would say it's the most important bilateral deal that the Philippines has signed since the end of Cold War. And with that gone, we have 170 days for a plot twist. The alliance is in big questions, including more than half of 380 joint exercises scheduled this year. Now, you can look at that headline and say, it's over, and for Trump, he's fine, no problem with that, because we're not going to force ourselves to help you. So people were expecting that the adults in the room or the American president will try to talk it out with President Duterte and get it over. My hunch was probably President Duterte was looking for, you must be familiar with this word, a quid pro quo, whereby in exchange for relaxation of human rights related sanctions against his top officials, if not himself, maybe he would keep the Visiting Forces Agreement. I think he realized perhaps he will not get that, and therefore the decision last week. Now, is this working? Here we go again. Is that the... Always happens to me, yeah. I think China is not very happy. At the same time, of course, you can also get the completely, opposite point of view and say it's over for China, right? Looking at the situation in China right now with the epidemic of coronavirus, of course, as more information comes in, it's becoming clear, right? I think Min Ching-pei, among others, have done a very good analysis to show that this latest epidemic is a reflection of the political disease that is afflicting the Chinese system. And the political disease is you have a highly centralized system, non-transparent, and whereby local government officials are scared to death, especially under Xi Jinping, to report anything negative. So it's one thing for them to distort numbers, economic numbers, to look at how they can get themselves promoted as much as possible, and that's related to a lot of debt buildup on the local government level in China. And then now we see a worse kind of that, which is people were scared to report. In fact, even reports coming out of Wuhan suggest that as early as December 8th, there was already knowledge about this, but it took until middle of January for there to be a response. So on the other hand, you can say, well, this is the Chernobyl of China, and the Chinese reputation is completely destroyed, and no one will trust China, and so on and so forth. And to be honest, the anti-China racism and anti-Asian racism, in fact, that we see around the world is quite troubling, in my opinion. Including the Philippines, a lot of Filipino-Chinese friends are now at the receiving ends of all sorts of slurs, which I think is extremely troubling. Now, I think the reality is somewhere more complicated. Does that keyboard thing work? Is that going to be quicker? Yeah, sorry.
It could be the battery.
Yeah, kind of ruins my moment. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Here, no,
sorry.
It does actually work. Just use the arrow
some
keys
people
here.
enter or
The arrow keys here.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Okay. I think if you want to understand how is China perceived and its influence across the region, I think the Kubler-Ross grief cycle helps us a lot. Countries like Taiwan, which I was staying in for half of last year as kind of semi-exile, I think they were already in acceptance stage, and they implemented the necessary countermeasures. As you know, Taiwan has been at the front line of what we call sharp power operations. You're very familiar with the Russian sharp power operations, but the sophisticated edge of Chinese sharp power operation was very much present in Taiwan, and it was actually very successful during the midterm elections 2 years ago. But this presidential elections, there was necessary preparations. And there was an element of luck, including the Hong Kong protests, which strengthened the narrative of President Tsai that any kind of engagement China towards a one China, multiple system, two or three system is not in the interest of the country, and it helped her that the economy did pretty well. So some countries are in the acceptance stage and they're responding accordingly. Some other countries, I'll discuss that later on, but you're quite familiar with, are literally in the bargaining stage. That's the case of Mahathir in Malaysia, who have been literally bargaining for a reduction in infrastructure-related debt, or what you call debt trap. And then you have countries like the Philippines, which I'll discuss a bit more later on, are caught somewhere between denial and anger. Denial on the part of President Duterte, who seems to see China in very positive light, perhaps in denial of basic facts. And then you have the people in the Philippines who are very angry, and I'll show that later on in your survey. So sometimes even internally countries are divided along the grief cycle. So let's go here. Okay. Now, there are two thinkers that I think really help us to understand what's happening in Southeast Asia and how is Southeast Asia navigating or coping with or adapting with or struggling with the rise of China. And one of them is, of course, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Not that he got everything right. I disagree with a lot of things he said, including his Asian values argument. But then the other one is Walter Benjamin. Is this? No, this one is
left or right, I think.
Left or right? Okay. Now, Lee Kuan Yew's argument, well, he made many arguments, but one of, I think, his most consequential arguments was that the rise of China does not require a balance of power reconfiguration or adjustment. So that was that kind of argument that was made during First and Second World War, right? With the rise of Germany or Japan, maybe if you made certain balance of power adjustments, you could avoid war, right? That's where the whole appeasement strategy of Chamberlain came into picture. Now, the argument of Lee Kuan Yew is that China is just so huge and so consequential that it will shock the whole system, per se. So you don't need only a new balance of power, you need new rules of the game. And this will completely overwhelm countries in the peripheries of China, including Singapore. That's why he had a very conscious effort to be essentially the middleman between West and China. And he has been advising people from Deng Xiaoping all the way to Xi Jinping before he passed away a few years ago. The other great thinker was Walter Benjamin. One of his most quotable reflections via Zizek, so I still have to confirm this if this is really his quote, is that behind every fascism, there's a failed revolution. Now, the revolution here is the inability of ASEAN and other concerned liberal powers in the Asia Pacific, or now we call it Indo-Pacific, to create some sort of a Kantian peace based on liberal institutions that preserve a semblance of balance of power based on norms of, trade-based and diplomacy-based interaction, right? So this kind of Kantian deficit. And the fascism is, of course, I'm not saying China is fascist, although things they're doing in Xinjiang may be already bordering on that. But the fascism here is the return of naked great power competition. And this is unfortunately quite explicitly reflected even in America's national defense strategy and national security strategy. The idea that America from now on will embrace great power competition. And President Trump's rhetoric very much embraces that. Right? Now, some of you may be familiar with this part of my presentation. I'll be very quick about that. Now, I spent some time in other parts of the world. Let's see. This is real. Okay. In fairness to ASEAN, we have achieved a lot from where we started back in the days of Confrontazie, right? I remember when I was doing a book chapter for this WikiLeaks books, right? I don't want to name that person anymore, but I had the chapter in Southeast Asia, so I had to go through cables from at least 1970s onwards. It took me 3 months to go through everything, and there's so much, there's just a whole treasure trove of, bombshells there, including things that Lee Kuan Yew said about Cambodia and Myanmar, among others. But one of the things that really got my attention was one of these cables whereby Najib Razak's father, the Razak Sr., asked the British to ask Kissinger, to ask Nixon, for Nixon to ask Marcos to essentially not invade Sabah, right? Because in the 1960s, the Philippines had the most advanced armed forces in the region. This was before they were bogged down in ugly domestic insurgency, which, by the way, the Malaysians obviously had a reason to contribute to, right? So 60s were very similar to what you see in parts of the world like Middle East today, right? This teetering on conflict, right? And in the case of Indonesia and emerging Malaysian Federation, it almost went to kinetic action. So from that to what we have today is it's a quantum leap, right? Whereby we effectively have what constructivists would call a security regime, whereby not only the use of force, but the threat of use of force is almost unthinkable. It's not that we no longer have disputes. We still have maritime and territorial disputes. Cambodia and Thailand almost came to blows earlier this decade over that holy temple on their border. But Indonesia successfully convinced the two countries to take the case to, if I'm not mistaken, ICJ, which was resolved accordingly. So if you look at ASEAN, we have come a very long way, especially compared to other developing regions of the world in terms of managing our disputes in the most peaceful way possible. We were able to also finance the ASEAN free trade way ahead of schedule, so much so that we became ambitious that we can create a common market by 2015. Of course, we have passed that mark, but we're getting closer to that. But I think one of the greatest strengths of ASEAN, in addition to also successful non-traditional security cooperation like trilateral border patrols with respect to the threat from ISIS and the 5-country patrols in the Malacca Straits to deal with other non-traditional security threats, is also the convening power of ASEAN, our ability to bring all the big powers under one roof and make them talk. I remember when the Philippines was the ASEAN chairman, two things stood out for me, among others, of course. One was to see Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Modi, Trump, all of them in Filipino Barong Tagalog and having their quadrilateral meeting, right? For some reason, all the important meetings are happening in Manila. I don't know why, which is quite ironic. So that was quite a sight for me, right? To bring all of these major players in ASEAN. And I don't think that would be as possible if not for the convening power of the ASEAN. And the other one was during the ASEAN Regional Forum when you had the North Korean Foreign Minister and the American Secretary of State more or less in the same room, right? Now, since the collapse of six-party talks, there are very few fora, right, where you can have this kind of direct interaction, and that's why the South Korean government invited us back in 2017 for the special Korea-ASEAN conference, whereby they were asking maybe ASEAN could help us out. And when I was in North Korea in 2018, we were getting special treatment as ASEAN people, because if you know, of course, China dominates like 80-90% of their trade, but precisely because we're the only alternatives to China, including a lot of illegal trade that they were doing in the past, that's why Southeast Asians are very important to North Korea, right? I remember towards the late 2017, the North Korean foreign minister sent a letter to Duterte to ask Trump not to go war with North Korea. You know, those kinds of events whereby Duterte will call Xi Jinping, then call Trump. He didn't talk to Kim Jong-un, but he talked to the foreign minister who's now gone, kind of got purged. So ASEAN also allows for smaller countries, ASEAN as an organization allows for smaller countries to play that very important intermediary role. Now, nonetheless, we have to make a distinction between ASEAN and Southeast Asia. ASEAN as an organization is a small and medium enterprise without human rights, right? That is ASEAN. It's different from Southeast Asia, which is 10 countries, and some of these countries are pretty large. So sometimes I conflate them, but we have to look at them in different contexts, especially later on. Now, nonetheless, as amazing as things have been, the problem we have right now with ASEAN is we are beginning to feel like if in economics there's a term middle income trap, we are having our own version of that middle institutionalization trap. So the consensus-based decision-making process, I mean, if you're familiar with Arabic, muwafaqat, consensus, is much closer to how the European Union operates the concept of consensus. But in ASEAN, unfortunately, we understand consensus as unanimity, right? Almost 100% of the time, 100%, all of us should be on that. That is problematic. Now, that work from almost a confrontative situation to some sort of a security community among ourselves. The problem right now is the same decision-making modalities may not be as successful for us to deal with this new security environment whereby you have essentially great power rivalry, right? And where China has an incentive to divide and conquer the region. Now, the problem with that is actually more subtle. There's a lot of Cambodia bashing going on inside ASEAN. Everyone is bashing Cambodia, saying, they don't want to talk about South China Sea. They block discussions on that. They're a Chinese proxy, among others. But the problem with that is when you have a unanimity-based decision-making process, each member effectively has a veto, whether they want it or not. So even if Cambodia doesn't want to have anything to do with South China Sea, and while they're dependent on China for probably 1/3 of their fiscal resources, inevitably they're going to come under pressure by China, whether visibly or stealthily or in a much more in-your-face manner, right? And Cambodia has no direct interest in the South China Sea. So in an absence of a real consensus-based or majority-based decision-making process, you unfairly put pressure on certain countries and you unfairly deny proportionate voice to countries that have direct interest. So there is an inbuilt injustice in the current setup. Now, it's not like the ASEAN has not used alternative mechanism. We have used the ASEAN minus X formula, kind of a majority voting process in economic negotiations, and it kind of worked. So the argument today is why not extend it to the security and more sensitive matters? And it's not only South China Sea. Obviously, when you had concerns over the ongoing ethnic cleansing in Rakhine, in Myanmar, Myanmar blocked any kind of consensus statement. So in ASEAN, you see more and more frequency of so-called chairman statement. So the chairman will have to make a statement when there's no consensus, and the chairman will more or less reflect the position of the majority, right? So the chairman's statement is emerging as the alternative mechanism because you essentially have an institutional paralysis. Now I'll go more quickly through that because I want to go to more the controversial part. I don't think this part is controversial enough. So that leaves ASEAN quite vulnerable to, in my presentation, vulnerable to, where are we? Okay, ripe for picking, right? And increasingly, we're seeing the phenomenon of ASEAN peripherality. In fact, what was very worrying for me is that for a long time, the criticism against ASEAN was inefficacy or fecklessness. The problem with ASEAN is actually worse now. The problem with ASEAN right now is it's acting almost as a shield for China against external powers. This is most prominent and self-evident on the issue of South China Sea, when especially the Philippines and later on Philippines as ASEAN-China country coordinator, you hear these statements whereby, including from President Duterte, the South China Sea dispute should be left untouched, meaning external powers back off. One of the interesting moments I had observing ASEAN was once when a Filipino foreign secretary came out, and this is just after Australia, US, and Japan had